The wind was the only thing that ever spoke the truth in this part of the country. It howled across the plains with a loneliness that matched the one in Evelyn's own heart, a mournful singer with a voice of dust and distance. It scraped against the thin walls of the cabin, rattled the single glass pane in the window, and whispered through the broken slats of the fence that marked the edge of Caleb's land. Her land. She was supposed to think, but it had never felt like hers. It felt like a cage, its bars stretching all the way to the bruised purple line of the horizon. From the small porch, where the floorboards had been bleached to the color of bone by the relentless sun, Evelyn watched that horizon as if expecting an answer from it. She was 22, but some mornings she would catch her reflection in the water bucket and see the eyes of a much older woman looking back, tired and weary. Her husband, Caleb, was gone again. He left without a word, as he always did, his horse kicking up a cloud of resentment that lingered in the air long after he disappeared over the rise. He would be gone for days, sometimes a week, off to town for reasons he never shared, and he would return smelling of cheap whiskey and a sour anger that was always looking for a place to land. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, a habit born less of cold and more of a need to hold herself together. It had been a different promise that brought her here, all the way from the green, orderly hills of Ohio, a promise made by her father, a man with too many daughters and not enough prospects, to a man he'd never met. Caleb Wright, he was called, a rancher with 100 acres to his name, a man of means, a man who could offer a future. The photograph he'd sent had shown a man in his late 30s, stern but not unkind, with eyes that looked straight at you. The letters that followed were brief, written in a cramped, deliberate hand, speaking of hard work and reward, of building something that would last. The man who had met her at the stagecoach stop had been 20 years older than his photograph, his eyes holding a flat, possessive light she hadn't recognized. The kindness was a thin veneer that cracked and fell away within the first week, revealing the hard, cold stone of the man beneath. The promise of a better life had soured into the reality of this homestead, a place shackled by his emotional coldness and a profound, aching isolation. He spoke to her in commands, his voice a flat, hard thing that expected obedience and offered no warmth. His touch, when it came, was not one of affection but of ownership, a heavy hand that left bruises not always on the skin. The days without him were a respite, a quiet, tense breath held in anticipation of his return. But the silence of his absence was filled with the unending labor the homestead demanded. The land was a cruel master, unforgiving of weakness or neglect. Evelyn fought it every day. Her mornings began before the sun, when the air was still sharp with the memory of the night. She would chop firewood, the axe handle smooth and foreign in her hands. Her swings clumsy at first, but growing more certain with each swing that sent a shock wave of effort up her arms. The woodpile grew slowly, a testament to her stubborn refusal to freeze when the winter winds came sweeping down from the mountains. She mended Caleb's shirts, her needle a tiny silver soldier marching across landscapes of ripped seams and frayed cuffs. She worked until her fingers were sore, her mind drifting back to an easier time, a time of quilting bees and laughter with her sisters, a world away from this stark, silent place. She tended to the chicken coop, a small, sad structure that stood empty. The last of the hens had been taken by a coyote a month back. Caleb had blamed her, of course, for not securing the latch, for being careless. He had not offered to buy more. The coop stood as a silent monument to a promise that had died, a place of intended life now hollow and quiet, the fields, cracked and thirsty, stretched out around her, mocking the neat, fertile gardens of her memory. Caleb had tried to grow corn one year, but the rains had not come, and the stalks had withered into yellow skeletons. He had not tried again. The loneliness was a physical weight. Miles of empty prairie separated her from the nearest town, a dusty collection of buildings called Redemption. The name felt like a bitter joke. When she had to go for supplies, riding the old mule because Caleb took the only good horse. The whispers followed her like a shadow. She could feel the eyes of the other women in the general store, the mixture of pity and judgment. They saw the faded bruise on her cheek, the way she flinched when the storekeeper raised his voice to a customer. They knew, but their knowledge was a closed circle, offering no entry, no help. She was Caleb Wright's wife. Caleb's problem. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, had once pressed a jar of preserves into her hand, her lips a thin line of Christian duty. "A man's temper is his own to wrestle with." "Child," she had said, her voice low. "A good wife's duty is to soothe it." The advice was as empty as the chicken coop, as barren as the fields. After that, Evelyn stopped looking for help in their faces. She learned to keep her eyes down, to make her lists, to get what she needed and leave. The silence of the ride home a welcome relief from the suffocating quiet of their judgment. One evening, as the sun bled across the western sky, staining the clouds in hues of orange and deep purple, the wind began to change. The mournful sigh became a restless growl. A storm was coming. Evelyn secured the latch on the cabin door, her gaze sweeping the horizon one last time. It was then she heard it. A sound that did not belong to the wind or the land, a sharp, splintering crack, followed by the pained cry of a horse. She stood frozen for a moment, listening. The sound had come from the direction of the old, rutted track that passed a half-mile north of the homestead. It was not a proper road, just a path for the lost or the desperate. She went inside, her heart a nervous bird beating against her ribs. She told herself it was nothing. A falling branch, a trick of the wind, but a part of her knew better. Through the single window, she watched as a storm front rolled in, a great dark wall of cloud that swallowed the remaining light. Rain began to fall, first as hesitant drops, then as a driving sheet that blurred the world outside. Lightning split the sky, and in the brief, stark illumination, she saw it, a wagon. Its back wheel shattered, tilted at a drunken angle. A lone horse stood nearby, its head hanging low, one leg held unnaturally off the ground, and a figure, a man, was moving slowly, deliberately, toward the faint light of her cabin. He was a silhouette against the storm, a man made of rain and shadow. Evelyn's hand went to the heavy iron bolt on the door. Caleb had taught her to shoot the old rifle that rested above the hearth. "Ain't no one comes to this place by accident," he'd grunted, "and no one comes on purpose with good intentions." His paranoia had seeped into the very walls of the cabin, and now it coiled in her stomach. She watched, unmoving. As the man drew closer, he limped heavily, his body canted to one side. With each flash of lightning, she saw more. He was tall, dressed in worn clothes that were plastered to his frame by the deluge. A wide-brimmed hat obscured his face, but she could see the cracked leather of his boots, boots that had seen more miles than she could imagine. Slung over his back was a rifle, the long, familiar shape of a Union soldier's Springfield. He was almost to the barn now, his steps faltering. He stumbled, caught himself, and pushed on, his head bent against the wind. He was not a threat, she realized with a sudden, startling clarity. He was a man at the end of his rope. She saw in his exhausted gait the same bone-deep weariness she felt in her own soul. He was just another creature beaten down by the unforgiving land. He reached the relative shelter of the barn's overhang and leaned against the wall, his whole body slumping. He slid down the rough-hewn planks, coming to rest in a heap on the muddy ground, and he did not move again. Evelyn's mind was a whirlwind of Caleb's warnings and the stranger's silent plea. To leave him out there was a death sentence. The night was growing cold, and the storm showed no sign of abating. But to bring him in, what danger was she inviting into her home? Caleb could return at any moment. His rage at finding a stranger in his house, being tended to by his wife, was a terrifying thing to contemplate. For a long minute, she did nothing. Torn between fear and a compassion she thought this place had long since scoured out of her. She thought of her own journey here, her own desperation. She thought of the cold eyes in town, the hands that would not reach out to help. She could not be one of them. She could not. With a deep breath that did little to calm her racing heart, she slid the bolt back. The sound was unnervingly loud in the small cabin, wrapping her shawl over her head. She stepped out into the storm. The wind tore at her, and the cold rain was a shock against her skin. She ran to the barn, her thin shoes sinking into the mud. He was unconscious, his face pale in the gloom. She pushed the wet hair back from his forehead. He was feverish, his skin burning to the touch. She finally saw his face clearly. He was younger than Caleb, perhaps in his late 20s, with a strong jawline and a mouth set in a grim line even in unconsciousness. Just beneath his jaw, a thin, white scar ran from his ear to the edge of his chin, a permanent accent to his hardship. His eyes were closed, but she imagined they would be quiet eyes, steady and old. He was Luke Mercer. Though she did not know his name yet, he was just a drifter, a piece of human wreckage washed up on her desolate shore. Summoning a strength she did not know she possessed, she managed to get him to his feet, draping his arm over her shoulders. He was a dead weight, mumbling words she couldn't understand. "Samuel, hold on! Samuel!" She half-dragged, half-carried him across the muddy yard and into the cabin, leaving a trail of wet earth on the floorboards she had swept only that morning. She barred the door behind them and dragged him close to the hearth. The fire was burning low, but it cast a warm, flickering light on his face. She peeled off his wet coat and shirt. On his side, just above his ribs, was a dark, angry gash, crusted with dried blood and mud. It looked like a wound from a knife or a sharp rock, inflamed and angry. For the rest of that night, Evelyn moved in a fog of urgency and fear. She boiled water, tearing strips from one of her own few good petticoats to use as bandages. She cleaned the wound as gently as she could. He cried out in his delirium, a raw, wounded sound that echoed the cries of the wind outside. She worked by firelight, every creak of the cabin, every howl of the storm making her jump, her ears straining for the sound of Caleb's horse. She managed to get some watered-down broth between his lips. He swallowed fitfully, his eyes flickering open once. They were gray, cloudy with fever, and they looked at her without seeing her before closing again. She sat in the lone wooden chair, the rifle on her lap, watching him breathe, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. She was not sure if she was guarding him from the world or herself from him. She was an unwilling nurse, an uncertain jailer, and she had invited a storm into her house that was far more dangerous than the one raging outside. The next day passed in a blur of gray light and pouring rain. The stranger's fever did not break. He drifted in and out of a restless sleep, his fragmented words painting pictures of battlefields and cold rivers. Evelyn tended the fire, forced more broth into him, and cleaned the wound again, which was red and hot to the touch. She moved his wagon, with its broken wheel, behind the barn, out of sight of the track. She tended to his lame horse as best she could, bringing it into the relative comfort of the barn. Every action was a thread, weaving her more deeply into this stranger's fate. By the second night, the storm had lessened to a steady, miserable drizzle. The fever finally broke. He woke near midnight, his eyes clear for the first time. They were gray, as she'd imagined, and filled with a deep, quiet caution. He tried to sit up, but a sharp intake of breath and a wince of pain stopped him. "Easy," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. He looked at her, then around the small, sparse cabin. His eyes rested on the rifle propped against the wall near the door, and then returned to her. "Where?" "My homestead," she answered, keeping her voice low. "Your wagon broke down. You have a fever." He absorbed this slowly, his gaze taking in the mended wound on his side. the cup of water on the small crate beside him, her weary face, a flicker of something. Gratitude, maybe, or just understanding, passed through his eyes. "Thank you," he said. The words were quiet, but they seemed to cost him a great deal of effort. "What's your name?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between them. "Luke," he said. "Luke Mercer." "Evelyn Wright." They spoke no more that night. An exhausted silence settled between them, different from the oppressive silence of Caleb's presence. This was a silence of two wounded animals, wary but sharing the same small patch of warmth from the fire. As she listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing join the soft patter of the rain, Evelyn felt a strange sense of calm. She had done a dangerous, foolish thing. But as she watched the stranger sleep, a man who had brought his own world of trouble into hers, she did not feel regret. She felt, for the first time in a very long time, a little less alone. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she would have to hide him. Caleb's return was an inevitability, a storm gathering just over the horizon, and she was now sheltering a secret that could destroy her. The sound of Caleb's horse was a sound of dread, a heavy, plodding rhythm that announced the return of the cold. Evelyn heard it from inside the cabin, and her blood ran still. Luke, who had been sitting quietly by the hearth, testing the strength in his legs, heard it too. His eyes met hers across the small room, and in them, she saw not fear, but a coiled and ready watchfulness. "The cellar," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. "Quickly." There was no time for argument. He moved with a speed that surprised her, his limp less pronounced than before. She pulled back the worn bearskin rug, her fingers fumbling with the iron ring on the trap door. It came open with a low groan, releasing a gust of cool, earthy air that smelled of damp soil and stored potatoes. He lowered himself into the darkness without a word, pulling his worn boots, which she had been trying to mend, down with him. She slid the heavy door back into place, smoothed the rug over it, and took a deep, shaky breath, just as the cabin door swung open. Caleb filled the doorway. He was a big man, broad in the shoulder and thick in the gut, his face flushed with drink and a simmering rage that seemed to be his natural state. His eyes, small and dark, swept the room, missing nothing. He brought the scent of the saloon with him, stale whiskey, sweat, and something acrid, like disappointment. "Woman," he grunted, his voice a gravelly thing. He kicked the door shut behind him, the sound making her flinch. "Supper." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, an order that expected immediate compliance. Evelyn moved to the stove, her body a carefully controlled machine. Do not show fear. Do not look him in the eye for too long. Do not give him a reason. She knew the rules of survival in this house. He dropped into his chair by the fire, shrugging off his heavy coat and letting it fall to the floor. He stretched his legs out, his own muddy boots steaming in the heat of the hearth. His gaze fell upon a spot near the wood box, and he fell silent. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. Luke's boots. In her haste, she had forgotten them. They were darker than Caleb's, more worn. The leather cracked like dry riverbeds. They were undeniably the boots of another man. Caleb stared at them for a long time, the silence stretching until it was a thin, screaming wire. He sniffed the air, a deliberate, animal-like gesture. "Smells different in here," he said, his voice dangerously soft. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the fire, but she felt his suspicion like a physical touch. "I aired the place out," she said, her voice tight. "The rain left it musty." He made a non-committal noise in his throat. He poked at the boots with the toe of his own. "Whose?" The word was a stone dropped into a deep well. Her mind raced, grasping for a plausible lie. "A trapper came by," she said, her hands busy with a cast-iron skillet, her back to him. "His horse had thrown a shoe. He was asking for your help, but I told him you were in town. I gave him some coffee while he waited out the rain. He left his boots to dry and must have forgotten them in his hurry. It was a weak story, full of holes she could only hope he was too drunk to see. He said nothing. The silence returned, heavier this time, freighted with his disbelief. She could feel him watching her, dissecting the story, searching for the lie. She risked a glance over her shoulder. He was no longer looking at the boots. He was looking at her. His eyes narrowed into slits, but he did not challenge her. He let it lie, a coiled snake between them. He preferred suspicion to certainty. It gave him an excuse. That night, she laid out his bedroll on the floor by the fire, as was their custom. He never slept in the bed with her unless he was in a certain mood, a mood that made her skin crawl, as he snored, a loud, wet sound that filled the small cabin. She lay awake on her cot, listening. She listened for any sound from the cellar below, praying Luke would remain silent. She listened to the sounds of Caleb's sleep, praying he would not wake. Sleep did not come. In the damp darkness of the cellar, Luke leaned against the stone foundation, the cold seeping into his bones. He was used to hardship, but this was a different kind, a helpless kind. He could hear the man's heavy footsteps above, the low rumble of his voice. He could feel the tension through the floorboards. It reminded him of another time, another kind of waiting. The memory came unbidden, as it often did in the dark, the mud of Virginia, thick and clinging, pulling at his boots, the constant gnawing fear that lived in the pit of his stomach, a fear you didn't talk about. And Samuel, his younger brother, barely 17, his face still holding the softness of the farm they'd left behind. Samuel, who had believed in the cause, in the speeches and the marching songs. Luke had only believed in keeping Samuel safe. It had been a meaningless skirmish, not a battle worthy of a name, a fight over a collapsed bridge spanning a muddy creek. The orders had been confused, the officers shouting over one another. A volley of rifle fire from the trees on the other side. It was chaos, smoke, and the screams of men. Luke had told Samuel to stay down, his voice raw, but Samuel, full of a boy's fire, had raised himself up to return a shot. Luke saw the puff of smoke from the trees, saw the surprised, questioning look on his brother's face, saw the dark stain blossom on his blue uniform. He had held Samuel as the life drained out of him, the boy's blood hot and sticky on his hands. "I'm cold, Luke," Samuel had whispered, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. And then he was gone. In that moment, the war, the Union, the whole bloody affair had turned to ash in Luke's mouth. It was all a lie, a grand, senseless slaughter of boys like Samuel. That night, under the cover of a freezing rain, Luke Mercer had walked away. He left his rifle, his uniform, and his name behind. He had been on the move ever since, a ghost haunted by the memory of his brother's last breath. He was a deserter, a man belonging to no one and no place, seeking a peace he was sure he would never find. The days that followed Caleb's return were a slow, agonizing dance of deception. Luke stayed hidden in the cellar during the day, emerging only when Evelyn was certain Caleb was out tending the few cattle that hadn't starved or wandered off. She would pass him food and fresh water, their hands brushing in the darkness, a fleeting contact that felt both dangerous and necessary. During those brief moments, Luke saw things. He saw the faint, yellowing bruise on her jaw, half hidden by her hair. He saw a fresher, angrier mark on her upper arm one morning when her sleeve slipped as she handed him a piece of bread. He saw the way she moved when Caleb was in the room, a subtle, constant flinching, as if she were always braced for a blow. He said nothing. He had no right. His presence in her home was a match held to a powder keg. But a cold, quiet rage began to build in him, an anger he hadn't felt since the day Samuel died. He watched Caleb's every move, his eyes missing nothing, his hands often clenching into fists at his sides. For her part, Evelyn lived on a knife's edge. The lie about the boots sat in her stomach like a stone. Caleb circled it, prodded it, without ever naming it. He would make comments about the cost of coffee, about the foolishness of helping strangers. Each word was a test, a threat. She dreamed of escape, vivid dreams where she was running under a wide, open sky, the wind in her hair, the homestead a shrinking speck behind her. But she always woke to the same four walls, the same crushing reality. She was trapped by the vast, unforgiving distance to any safe harbor, trapped by a woman's duty, a promise her father had made and she was forced to keep, and most of all, trapped by a deep, paralyzing fear of what Caleb would do if she ever tried to leave. He had told her once, his voice calm, that he would find her, and she believed him. In the stolen moments of Caleb's absence, a silent understanding grew between her and Luke. It was built not on words, but on actions. One afternoon, while Caleb was out hunting, the flimsy latch on the cabin door finally gave way. Evelyn had struggled with it for months. Luke, his hands surprisingly deft, fixed it in under an hour, using a piece of scrap metal he found in the barn. The solid, satisfying click of the repaired latch was a small sound of security in a life that had none. He took to chopping wood for her, his movements still stiff from his wound, but steady and strong. He worked in the small clearing behind the barn, out of sight of the cabin. The rhythmic thud of the axe, a secret conversation between them. She would bring him water, and they would stand for a moment in the cool air, the scent of fresh-cut pine between them, saying little. Words were too dangerous, but in their shared silence, something was being built, a fragile bridge of trust over a chasm of loneliness and fear. Then one night, Caleb announced he was riding to a neighboring ranch to trade for a horse, a journey that would take him away for at least 2 days. He left at dawn, and as the sound of his horse faded, the tension that had gripped the homestead for a week finally eased its hold. The silence he left behind was a clean, healing thing. That evening, a fire burned brightly in the hearth. The storm had long passed, leaving the air washed clean and the night sky brilliant with a spill of stars. For the first time, Luke did not retreat to the cellar. He sat in the chair that was usually Caleb's, while Evelyn sat on a small stool opposite him. She had made coffee, and the rich, dark aroma filled the cabin, a scent of simple, quiet comfort. They drank from tin cups, the warmth seeping into their hands. For a long time, they just sat, watching the flames dance and whisper. It was Evelyn who finally broke the silence. "Your scar," she said softly, her eyes on the thin white line beneath his jaw. "How did you get it?" It was a bold question, a step onto the bridge they had been building. Luke touched it absently, a familiar gesture. He looked into the fire, his face cast in flickering light and shadow. "War," he said, his voice low. "A piece of shrapnel from a cannonball. It was my first battle. I thought it was a grand thing, to be marked like that. A story to tell." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "I learned later that the ugliest scars are the ones no one can see." He told her about the farm in Pennsylvania, about his brother, about the muddy creek and the senselessness of it all. He told her the truth, without a trace of self-pity, his voice flat and weary with memory. When he finished, the silence returned. But it was different now. It was filled with the weight of his story, of his loss. Evelyn's heart ached for him, for the boy who had died, and for the man who had been running ever since. After a while, Luke raised his eyes from the fire and looked at her. His gaze was steady, and in its gray depths, she saw an honest question. "He's a hard man," Luke said. It was not an accusation, but a simple statement of a truth they both knew. "Why do you stay?" The question undid her. It was the one she had asked herself 1,000 times in the dead of night. It was the one the women in town whispered about, but to hear it spoken aloud, by this quiet stranger who had seen the truth of her life in just a few short days, broke something open inside her. She tried to form an answer, to speak of duty, of promises, of fear, but the words would not come. Instead, a single tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cheek, then another. She did not sob, but wept in silence, her shoulders shaking with the force of all the unshed tears she had held inside for so long. Luke did not move. He did not reach for her. He simply sat there, a silent witness to her grief, his presence a strange and unexpected comfort. He let her cry until the storm inside her had passed, leaving a raw, aching quiet in its wake. The fire burned low, the logs collapsing into a soft bed of glowing embers. The coffee in their cups was cold. The space between them was charged with unspoken things, with shared pain and a fragile, burgeoning intimacy. Their hands rested on the rough wooden arms of their chairs, inches apart. A small movement was all it would take to close the distance, to touch, but neither of them moved. Not yet. Evelyn finally raised her head, her eyes red but clear. She looked at him, this drifter, this deserter, this man with scars both seen and unseen, who had shown her more kindness in a week than her husband had in a year. The night was almost over. Soon, the sun would rise, and the harsh light of day would return. "Promise me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackle of the dying fire. "Promise me tonight won't disappear come morning." Luke looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. The flames cast shadows that danced across his face, hiding his eyes. He heard the desperation in her voice, the plea for this one moment of peace and understanding, to have meaning beyond the confines of this single night. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He could not promise her a morning he did not have. He could not promise a future he was running from. And so, he said nothing at all. He just held her gaze as the last of the fire crumbled into ash. The day Caleb was due to return came and went, marked only by a sky the color of a lead slug and a sharp, biting wind that carried the first hint of a deeper cold. Evelyn found herself watching the horizon not with the usual dread, but with a new, more complicated anxiety. By midday, the first snowflakes began to fall. They were not the gentle, picturesque flakes of her Ohio childhood, but small, hard pellets that ticked against the window pane like tiny, insistent fingers. Luke watched them from the hearth. "This isn't stopping anytime soon," he said, his voice a low murmur. He had an instinct for the weather, the way a sailor has for the sea. He was right. By evening, the world outside the cabin had been erased. The snow came down in a thick, silent curtain, burying the broken fences, smoothing the cracked earth, and piling in soft, treacherous drifts against the barn. The wind rose to a high, keening howl, a wild thing trying to claw its way inside. The homestead was no longer just isolated. It was an island, a tiny, flickering point of light in a vast, churning ocean of white. There would be no travel for days. All tracks, coming or going, were gone. Caleb was not coming home. A strange and fragile peace settled over the small cabin, born of their shared imprisonment. The oppressive weight of Caleb's imminent return was lifted, and in its place, a quiet, domestic rhythm began to form between them. It was a rhythm of necessity, but it felt like something more. They moved around each other in the cramped space with an unconscious grace, a silent awareness of the other's presence. Mornings were for chores. Luke, his wound now a dull, healing ache, would bundle himself in Caleb's spare coat, a garment that hung loosely on his leaner frame, and venture out into the blinding white to chop wood and tend to the animals in the barn. He moved with a grim determination, the cold air stinging his face. Evelyn would watch him from the window, a dark, solitary figure battling the storm, and feel a protective ache in her chest. When he came back inside, his eyebrows and the brim of his hat caked with snow. She would have hot coffee waiting for him. He would take the cup with a quiet nod of thanks, his cold fingers brushing hers, and the small, accidental touch would send a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. They cooked together, a shared, unspoken partnership. She would mix the corn batter while he sliced the salted pork he'd found in her nearly bare pantry. They learned each other's habits. He was methodical, neat, cleaning the knife after every use. She was more improvisational, adding a pinch of dried herbs to the stew, a habit from a life where flavor was not a luxury. They ate their meals in the warm circle of firelight, the howl of the wind a constant reminder of the world they were shut away from. In the long, silent afternoons, when the work was done and the storm offered no respite, a stillness would fall. Evelyn would take up her sewing, her needle a tiny, rhythmic flash in the dim light. Luke found Caleb's Bible on a high shelf, its leather cover cracked and its pages thin and softened with use. He would sit in the chair by the fire and read, his brow furrowed in concentration. She could not tell what passages he read, but the quiet turning of the pages was a comforting sound. Sometimes she would look up from her mending and find him watching her, his gray eyes thoughtful, and he would quickly look back down at the book, as if caught in a private thought. The air between them grew thick with things unsaid, with a shared loneliness that was slowly, imperceptibly, turning into a shared solace. One night, the third of the storm, the wind finally seemed to tire of its assault. The cabin grew quieter, the only sounds the soft hiss and crackle of the fire and the whisper of their own breathing. They sat as they had before, on opposite sides of the hearth. The silence felt different this time, heavier, charged with the intimacy that their forced proximity had created. Evelyn looked at Luke's hands as they rested on the arms of the chair. They were strong hands, calloused and capable, the hands of a man who knew work. But there was a gentleness in them too, in the way he had fixed the latch, in the way he handled the fragile pages of the old Bible. On impulse, an urge born of a deep and desperate need for a simple, kind human connection. She reached across the small space between them and laid her hand lightly on his. His reaction was swift and sharp. He flinched, pulling his hand back as if her touch had burned him. The rejection was so sudden, so total, that it was like a slap. A hot flush of shame and hurt rose in her cheeks, and she quickly drew her own hand back, cradling it in her lap. She stared into the fire, her eyes stinging, unable to look at him. The silence that followed was a terrible, wounded thing. She thought she had been wrong, that she had mistaken his quiet presence for something it was not. She had offered a piece of her fragile hope, and he had thrown it back at her. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice rough. She risked a glance at him. He was not looking at her. He was staring at his own hands, clenched now into tight fists. The expression on his face was not one of revulsion or anger. It was one of deep, agonizing pain. It was the look of a man at war with himself. "It's not you, Evelyn," he said, his voice low and strained. "It's me. I ain't fit for it." "Fit for what?" she whispered, her hurt giving way to confusion. A friendly touch. He shook his head, a gesture of profound weariness. He looked up, and his eyes were dark with old ghosts. "I had a girl once," he said, the words coming out in a rush, as if a dam had broken inside him. "Back in Pennsylvania, her name was Anna. We were to be married when I came back from the war." He paused, swallowing hard. The firelight carved deep lines into his face. "I didn't go back, not right away. I wandered for a time, trying to walk the war out of my boots. I sent letters, but they were few. By the time I finally turned my feet for home, it was too late." He looked away, his gaze fixed on some distant, painful memory. "She died. She had a baby. My son. Neither of them made it." He fell silent, but the story hung in the air. A tragedy so immense it seemed to suck the very warmth from the fire. Evelyn sat frozen, her own small hurt forgotten, her heart breaking for this man and the life he had lost. I wasn't there, he continued, his voice barely a whisper. I was supposed to be there, to take care of her. But I was running. From the war, from myself. And she paid the price for it. Everything I touch, it turns to ruin. I bring trouble. Evelyn, I bring sorrow. He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a bleak, desolate certainty. That's why I pulled away. A man like me has no right to a gentle touch. It's a promise I can't keep. His confession settled into the quiet of the cabin, a weight of grief that she felt in her own chest. She saw him then not as a drifter or a stranger, but as a man who had been hollowed out by loss, who had sentenced himself to a lifetime of exile as penance for a tragedy he could not control. Tears welled in her eyes again, not for herself this time, but for him, for Anna, for the baby who never drew a breath. She picked up her sewing, needing something to do with her hands, and as she pushed the needle through the rough cloth, silent tears began to fall, dotting the fabric like tiny, dark pearls. "This place," she said, her own voice thick with unshed grief, the words coming from that deep, buried part of her. "This place has buried me alive." It was her confession, her own story of a life lost, laid bare in the firelight. They were two ghosts in a storm, haunted by different pasts, but joined by the same profound ache of loneliness. The admission changed the air between them again. The last barriers of restraint, of caution, had been worn away by their shared vulnerability. The closeness that had been growing steadily over the past few days became a palpable, unbearable thing. It was a magnetic pull, a force of nature as undeniable as the storm outside. The small space of the cabin seemed to shrink, the firelight drawing them into a world that contained only the two of them. She looked up from her sewing, her eyes meeting his. The question that had been in her touch was now in her gaze, and this time, he did not look away. He rose from his chair and came to her, kneeling on the floor in front of her stool. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently, tentatively, cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking the line of her cheek. His touch was not a brand of ownership, like Caleb's, but a question, a comfort. It was the kindest touch she had ever known. She leaned into it, closing her eyes, a sob catching in her throat. And then he lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a desperate, hungry thing, a collision of two starving souls. It was filled with all the sorrow and loneliness and unspoken need that had simmered between them for days. It was the raw, aching tenderness of his confession and the quiet desperation of hers. He tasted of coffee and wood smoke and a sadness so deep it felt ancient. She kissed him back with a ferocity that surprised them both, her hands coming up to clutch at his shirt, pulling him closer, as if she could absorb his warmth, his strength, his very presence into herself. He lifted her from the stool, his arms strong around her, and carried her the few steps to her narrow cot. He laid her down gently, his eyes never leaving hers, and in them she saw a reflection of her own desperate need. What happened next was not a wild, passionate affair, but something quieter, deeper, and far more intense. It was a slow, tender exploration, a silent conversation in a language of touch. It was the sorrowful meeting of two people who had been broken by life and who, for one stolen night, found in each other a way to feel whole again. Every touch was a discovery, every caress a revelation. It was aching and beautiful and utterly heartbreaking. In the warm darkness, wrapped in his arms, Evelyn felt a sense of peace she had never imagined possible. It was a fragile peace, a stolen peace, but it was real. "I've never been loved," she whispered against his chest, the confession a final, quiet surrender. "Not even once, not really." He held her tighter, his lips in her hair, but he offered no empty words, no false promises. He simply held her, and in his embrace, she felt the truth of her own words. This was what it felt to be cherished, to be wanted not for duty or for use, but for oneself. Their union was a quiet, intense thing, a secret pact made in the heart of a storm, something precious precisely because it was stolen and never promised. Morning came too soon. A pale, gray light filtering through the snow-caked window. It brought with it the cold, hard reality of their situation. The storm had broken, and the world outside was eerily silent, draped in a thick, pristine blanket of white. Guilt was a heavy presence in the small cabin. It lay between them on the narrow cot, a cold reminder of the lines they had crossed. Luke rose first, dressing quietly in the dim light. He did not look at her, but she watched him, memorizing the line of his back, the set of his shoulders. The tenderness of the night was gone, replaced by a grim resolve. He finally turned to face her. His expression shuddered, his gray eyes guarded. "I'll leave as soon as I can dig a path for the horse," he said, his voice flat. "The snow will hold for now, but it'll melt soon enough. It's better if I'm gone before—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Before Caleb returns, the name was a specter that had returned with the daylight. Evelyn's heart felt as if it were cracking into 1,000 tiny pieces. She had known this was coming. She had known the night was a fantasy, a brief, impossible dream. But the finality of his words was a physical blow. She wanted to scream, to beg him to stay, to ask him to take her with him, but she knew she couldn't. He was a man on the run, and she was a married woman. To follow him would be to invite ruin upon them both. So she simply nodded, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. She gave him the only thing she had left to give, her quiet, heartbreaking acceptance. "I know," she whispered. He looked at her for a moment longer, a flicker of deep regret in his eyes. And then he turned and went outside, the cold air rushing into the cabin in his wake. He had been gone for less than an hour. The sound of his shovel scraping against the snow, a lonely, rhythmic counterpoint to her own shattered thoughts. When she heard it, a sound that made the blood freeze in her veins, it was the unmistakable sound of a horse, whinnying a greeting to the animals in the barn, a sound of a rider, unexpected and far, far too early. The cabin door flew open, and Caleb stood there, covered in snow, his face a mask of black fury. The world outside was a picture of serene, silent beauty. Inside the cabin, it was the sound of a closing trap. Caleb's presence sucked the air from the room, replacing it with a cold, menacing pressure. Luke, caught in the open, moved with a hunter's instinct for cover. There was no time for the cellar. His eyes darted upward, to the small, square opening of the hayloft above the main room, a dark mouth of shadow. A ladder of rough-hewn pegs was nailed to the wall beside it. "Get up there," Evelyn breathed, her voice so low it was barely a sound. She moved to block Caleb's view, her body a frail but determined shield. Luke was already moving, scaling the pegs with a silent agility that belied his wound. He swung himself into the loft just as Caleb's heavy boots stamped onto the porch. The floorboards above creaked once, a sound as loud as a gunshot in the tense silence. Evelyn's heart seized. She prayed Caleb, his ears full of the wind, had not heard. Caleb entered, bringing a blast of frigid air and the scent of wet wool and fury. He slammed the door, making the tin cups on the shelf rattle. His eyes, small and hard as river stones, fixed on her. He was not drunk this time. He was something worse, sober and coiled with a sharp, suspicious rage. "Storm let up," he said. It was not a conversation. It was an accusation. "Figured I'd make it back." He began to unbutton his coat, his gaze sweeping the room, a predator assessing its territory. And then his eyes stopped. They stopped on the same spot as before, near the hearth, on Luke's mended boots. In the chaos, they had forgotten them again. They sat there, a blatant, damning testament to another man's presence. "Still here, are they?" Caleb's voice was deceptively calm, a low growl that promised violence. Your trapper must be a forgetful man, or a slow one. Evelyn's mind was a blank wall of panic. The previous lie, so flimsy in the daylight, was now an impossibility. Caleb had been gone for days. No trapper would wait that long. She could feel Luke's presence above her, a silent, helpless witness. She had to protect him. She had to survive this. "He came back," she said, her voice thin and reedy. She hated the sound of it, the weakness. "The storm. It was too much for his horse. He stayed in the barn. He left just this morning, when the snow stopped." Caleb slowly, deliberately, pulled off his wet gloves, finger by finger. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the boots. "In the barn," he repeated, savoring the words, tasting the lie in them. "You let a stranger sleep in my barn for 3 days." "I was afraid," she said, the words tasting like ash. "The storm." "Afraid," he sneered, finally turning his gaze on her. The contempt in his eyes was a physical blow. "You ain't afraid of anything you ought to be." He walked to the hearth and picked up one of the boots. He turned it over in his big hands, examining the new stitching on the seam. Evelyn's stitching. His eyes narrowed. "Did you mend his boots for him too? Part of your Christian charity?" "He had nothing," she whispered. "He had my wife, it seems," Caleb said. And in that moment, the pretense of questioning was over. He did not need proof. Her fear was proof enough. His wounded pride was all the reason he required. He threw the boot into the corner, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet cabin. That night was the longest of Evelyn's life. Caleb did not speak to her again. He ate the supper she prepared in a thick, simmering silence, his jaw working, his eyes never leaving her. She felt like a mouse under the gaze of a hawk. From the loft, Luke watched through a crack in the floorboards, a knot of ice and fire in his gut. He saw the way she moved, her shoulders hunched, her hands trembling slightly as she served the food. He saw the cold, possessive glare Caleb fixed on her. He felt a helplessness so profound it was like drowning. Later, when the cabin was dark, save for the sullen red glow of the embers in the hearth, it happened. Caleb rose from his bedroll. Evelyn, lying on her cot, feigned sleep, her body rigid. He crossed the room to her. There were no shouts, no accusations. The violence, when it came, was a quiet, methodical, and brutal thing. It was not about punishing her for a transgression he could not prove. It was an act of pure spite, a reassertion of his ownership, a way of taming something he suspected was growing wild within her. In the loft, Luke heard the soft shuffle of footsteps, a muffled cry that was bitten off almost before it began, the sickening, rhythmic sound of a hand striking flesh. He squeezed his eyes shut, his knuckles white where he gripped the rough planking. Every sound was a blade twisting in his gut. He had failed to protect Samuel, and now he was failing to protect her. The rage that had been building in him for days finally broke its chains. It was a white-hot, blinding fury, a force that demanded blood. He saw Caleb stand over her, a hulking shadow against the firelight. He saw her curl into a small, tight ball, her face turned to the wall, and that was all he could bear. He moved, no longer a hiding man, but an avenger. He descended the ladder, his feet making no sound on the pegs. He crossed the floor, his body a vessel of pure, murderous intent. Caleb heard him a second too late. He turned, his face a mask of surprise, just as Luke's fist connected with his jaw. The crack of bone on bone echoed in the cabin. Caleb staggered back, shock and pain warring in his eyes. He was a big man, but Luke was fueled by a righteous fury that gave him the strength of 10. He launched himself at Caleb, his hands finding the man's throat, his thumbs pressing down. He was no longer Luke Mercer, the quiet drifter. He was an instrument of retribution, intent on squeezing the life from this monster, on silencing the cruel voice and stopping the brutal hands forever. Caleb's face began to turn a dark, mottled purple. His hands clawed at Luke's wrists, his eyes bulging with terror. Luke pressed harder, a roaring in his ears, the memory of his brother's dying gasp mixing with the satisfaction of this vengeance. "Luke, no!" The voice was a raw, desperate cry. Evelyn's. She was on her knees beside them, her hand on his arm, her face bruised and swollen in the dim light, her eyes wide with a terror that was not for herself, but for him. "Please," she begged, her voice a ragged whisper. "Do not do this. Do not become him." Her words cut through the red haze of his rage. He looked from her pleading face to the sputtering, dying man beneath him. She was right. To kill him would be to let the violence of this world win. It would make him a murderer, a man to be hunted and hanged. It would destroy any chance of a future, for either of them. With a final, shuddering gasp of effort, he released his grip. Caleb fell to the floor, choking and gasping for air like a landed fish. Luke stood over him, his chest heaving, the urge to kill still thrumming in his veins. But Evelyn's hand on his arm was an anchor in the storm. He allowed her to pull him away. The next morning dawned under a sky of bitter, bruised gray. The three of them had not slept. Caleb nursed his throat and his pride in one corner, his eyes burning with a venomous hatred. Luke and Evelyn sat by the cold hearth, the terrible events of the night a chasm between them. The fragile peace of their stolen days was shattered, replaced by the grim reality of what had to happen next. "You have to go," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. It was the only way to keep her feelings in check. If she allowed herself to feel, she would fall apart. "He will go to the sheriff. He will tell them a drifter broke into his home and attacked him. They will believe him." Luke knew she was right. "I cannot leave you here with him." "You must," she insisted, finally looking at him. Her eyes were wells of unshed tears. "If you stay, he will see you hang. That is not a victory. That is just more ruin. Please, Luke, go. For me." It was a sacrifice, the hardest one she had ever made. She was sending away the only kindness she had known in this place, sending him out into the cold for his own safety. He saw the iron resolve in her face, the love that was hidden beneath the strength. Arguing would only cause her more pain. He gathered his few belongings. She pressed a small bundle of bread and salted meat into his hands. Their fingers touched one last time, a spark of warmth against the coming cold. There were 1,000 things to say, 1,000 promises and regrets, but there was no time and no place for them. Their farewell was in a single, long look, a silent acknowledgement of what they had found and what they were about to lose. He walked out of the cabin without a backward glance. If he looked back, he knew he would not be able to leave. Evelyn watched from the barn, hiding in the shadows so Caleb would not see. She watched as he led his horse through the deep snow, his shoulders set against the gray sky. She watched until he was just a small, dark speck against the vast, unforgiving white of the prairie. And then he was gone. The tears she had been holding back finally came, hot and burning against her frozen cheeks. Later that week, Caleb rode into Redemption. He walked into the saloon, his throat still wrapped in a bandage, and bought a round of whiskey. He leaned against the bar, a man in full possession of his world. "A wife is like a horse," he announced to the room of dusty, unshaven men. "Sometimes you have to break them, remind them who holds the reins. My little woman at home. She got a bit wild, but she's tame now, gentle as a lamb." The men chuckled, some nodding in agreement, others looking down into their glasses. It was a man's world, and this was a man's talk. Luke was in the back of that same saloon, nursing a single beer, trying to gather enough money for supplies before he headed into the mountains. He heard every word, the boast, the cruel laughter. The rage from that night returned, a hot, sick wave. He stood up, his hand clenched, ready to finish what he had started. But then he saw the sheriff's deputy drinking at a nearby table. A fight now would mean a jail cell and questions he could not answer. It would only bring more trouble down on Evelyn. With a will of iron, he forced himself to sit down. He drained his beer, threw his last few coins on the table, and walked out. The sound of Caleb's bragging a spur in his back. Back at the homestead, something in Evelyn had changed. The beating had not broken her spirit. It had forged it into something hard and sharp. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a quiet, burning anger. She was done being a victim. She moved through her days with a new, deliberate purpose. When Caleb was gone, she began to prepare for something uncertain. She packed a small canvas sack, not with clothes, but with small, essential things. A tin of her mother's sewing needles, the small, worn Bible, a half-burned candle, a small, sharp knife from the kitchen. They were the tools of a survivor, the meager possessions of a person planning not just to endure, but to escape. Caleb returned from town sullen and drunk. He found her mending one of his shirts, her face a calm, unreadable mask. His power over her fear was a thing he savored, and her new composure unsettled him. He prowled the small cabin, looking for a way to break it, to see that familiar flicker of terror in her eyes. He was throwing a log on the fire when he saw it. Tucked into a crevice between the hearthstones was a small, rolled piece of cloth, a scrap of her petticoat, stained with a brownish-red rust, a piece of the bandage she had used on Luke's wound. He picked it up. He unrolled it. He sniffed it. It smelled faintly of blood and the poultice of herbs she had used. And he knew. The trapper, the stranger, the fight. It all clicked into place in his mind with a terrible, clarifying certainty. The man had been in his house for days. He had been wounded, and she had tended to him. The lie was no longer a suspicion. It was a betrayal, a raw, gaping wound to his pride. His face contorted into a mask of pure fury. He said nothing to her. He strode to the wall, took down his heavy rifle, and checked the load. He grabbed a box of cartridges from the shelf and shoved them into his coat pocket. He turned to her then, his eyes burning with a murderous light. "He's a dead man," he said, his voice a low, guttural promise. And then he was gone, slamming the door behind him. Evelyn ran to the window. She saw him saddle his horse with a vicious speed. She saw him ride out, not toward town, but north, toward the jagged, snow-dusted peaks of the mountains where Luke had said he was heading. He was not just a brute now. He was a hunter, and he was hunting Luke. In that moment, Evelyn made a choice. The quiet preparation was over. The time for waiting had passed. She would not stay here, a prisoner in this cabin, waiting to see which of them came back. For the first time in her life, she committed an act of pure, unadulterated defiance. She ran to the barn, her heart hammering against her ribs, not with fear, but with a wild, fierce resolve. She threw a saddle on the old mule, its back bony and unfamiliar. She did not bother with a bridle, just a rope halter. There was no time. As a new bank of dark, heavy clouds began to roll in from the west, promising more snow, she urged the mule into a clumsy trot, following the deep tracks Caleb's horse had left in the snow. She was riding after both of them, into the high country, into the heart of a coming storm. She did not know what she would do when she found them. She only knew she could not stay behind. She was no longer Caleb's wife, a victim of circumstance. She was Evelyn, and she was riding into a fight that was her own. The air in the high country was different. It grew thin and sharp, and the world became a silent, suffocating place of white snow and black rock. The jagged peaks of the mountains loomed like the teeth of a great animal, a place where the wind moaned through skeletal pines and the sun was a distant, indifferent eye. Evelyn urged the old mule forward, her body numb with a cold that had sunk past her skin and into her bones. Her lungs burned with every breath. The tracks of Caleb's horse were a lifeline. A dark, deliberate trail she followed with a grim tenacity she had not known she possessed. She had been riding for hours, losing all sense of time in the hypnotic rhythm of the mule's clumsy gait. The sky, which had been a threatening gray, was now turning a deep, bruised purple, and the snow had begun to fall again, this time with a lazy, menacing thickness that promised to obliterate the path before her. She was about to give in to the despair that clawed at the edges of her resolve when she heard it. Not the wind, but a human sound. A shout, ugly and raw, torn apart by the gusts. She slid off the mule, her legs nearly buckling, and crept forward, using a line of snow-dusted boulders for cover. The voices grew clearer. She peered around a rock and saw them. They were in a narrow canyon, a natural dead end walled by sheer rock faces. A small fire sputtered in a pit of stones, a pathetic circle of warmth against the encroaching storm. Caleb's horse was tethered nearby. Luke's was nowhere in sight. Caleb stood with his rifle leveled, but he was not aiming to shoot. He was using it to keep Luke at a distance. Luke stood on the other side of the fire, his hands slightly raised, his body tense. He looked exhausted, his face gaunt in the flickering firelight. "You came into my house." Caleb's voice was a low, guttural snarl, amplified by the close canyon walls. "You put your hands on my property." "She is not your property," Luke said, his own voice quiet but carrying a steel edge that cut through the wind. "She is a human being." "She is my wife," Caleb roared, taking a step forward. "And you are a dead man, a thief and a coward, crawling into another man's home, poisoning his wife against him." "She needed no poisoning," Luke retorted, his eyes flashing with a cold fire. "You did all the work yourself." The words were a spark to dry tinder. With a cry of pure rage, Caleb lunged, not with the rifle, but with his fists. He swung the heavy gun like a club, aiming for Luke's head. Luke ducked, and the rifle butt whistled past his ear. The fight was not a clean contest of skill. It was a brutal, ugly thing, fueled by years of Caleb's possessive pride and Luke's simmering, righteous anger. It was a fight born of heartbreak and betrayal, a primal clash between two men over the soul of one woman. They crashed to the ground, rolling in the snow, their grunts and the sickening crunch of their blows echoing in the confined space. Caleb had the weight and the brute strength, his fists like hammers. Luke had a wiry, desperate speed and the grim knowledge of how to survive. He took a heavy blow to his side, the one that was already wounded, and a gasp of pure agony escaped his lips. Caleb grinned, a cruel, triumphant expression, and pressed his advantage, pinning Luke to the ground, his thumbs gouging for Luke's eyes. But pain gave Luke a new, sharper focus. He bucked, throwing Caleb off balance, and scrambled for a rock, his fingers closing around a heavy, jagged stone. He swung it blindly, connecting with the side of Caleb's head. Caleb grunted, his grip loosening, a dark trickle of blood appearing at his temple. Luke pushed him away and staggered to his feet, gasping for air, the world tilting and swaying around him. Caleb rose more slowly, shaking his head like a stunned bull. The cut on his temple only seemed to fuel his fury. He picked up a burning branch from the fire, embers scattering like angry fireflies, and came at Luke again, a wild, cornered animal. The fight was a desperate, chaotic dance around the sputtering fire. Luke managed to wrest the branch from Caleb's hand, but not before a shower of sparks landed on his own sleeve, burning through to the skin. He saw an opening. As Caleb lunged again, Luke sidestepped and brought his fist around in a powerful, hooking blow that caught Caleb square on the jaw. The sound was flat and final. Caleb's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed, a dead weight in the snow, his body landing mere inches from the fire. He was unconscious. Luke stood over him, his chest heaving, his body a map of fresh pain. The rifle lay nearby. He could end it. He could pick up the gun and put a stop to Caleb's cruelty forever. The thought was a dark, seductive whisper in his mind. One shot, and Evelyn would be free. One shot, and his own flight could finally be over. He looked down at the man who had caused so much pain, his face slack and defenseless in the firelight. He saw Samuel's face for a moment, another life extinguished in a moment of violence. To land that final, fatal blow would be to surrender the last piece of the man he was trying to be. It would not be justice. It would be an execution, cold and final, and it would stain him in a way that even the war had not, with a ragged sigh that turned into a cloud of white in the freezing air. He let the thought go. He would not kill him. It was at that moment that Evelyn stumbled into the clearing. She was a half-frozen specter, her face pale, her lips blue, her eyes wide with a desperate fear. "Luke," she breathed, her voice cracking. She ran to him, her feet sinking into the deep snow. She saw Caleb's still form on the ground, the blood at his temple, and her eyes flew back to Luke, searching for injury. She saw the fresh gash on his side, bleeding sluggishly through his torn shirt, the burn on his arm, the split in his lip. "We have to go," she pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Now, before he wakes up, we can run, together." He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not relief but a deep, weary sorrow. He swayed on his feet, his hand going to his side, and when he pulled it away, it was dark with blood. The fight had reopened his old wound. "I cannot run. Evelyn," he said, his voice strained. "Not like this. You need to go. Take his horse. Ride as far as you can." She stared at his bleeding side, then at the vast, empty wilderness around them, then at Caleb's unconscious form. The choice was a razor's edge. She could run, as he said, save herself. It was the sensible thing to do. Or she could stay with a wounded man, with a storm bearing down on them, and a violent husband who would wake up with murder in his heart. To stay was madness. It was suicide. She looked into Luke's gray eyes, saw the pain he was trying to hide, and she knew there was no choice at all. Running alone was just another form of being buried alive. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I am not leaving you." Her eyes scanned the canyon walls, searching, desperate, and then she saw it. Tucked back under a rocky overhang, almost completely hidden by a drift of snow, was the low, dark shape of a door. An old trapper's cabin, long abandoned. It was their only hope. Summoning a strength she did not know she had, she helped him drag Caleb's heavy body away from the fire and into the biting wind. The effort was immense, their feet slipping in the snow, their breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. They pulled him into the small, dark cabin, a one-room hovel that smelled of cold earth, old smoke, and animal musk. It was barely shelter, but it was out of the wind. "Find some rope," she said to Luke, who was leaning against the wall, his face pale. She tore strips from the hem of her own cloak, her fingers clumsy with cold, and used them to bind Caleb's hands and feet, tightly and securely. Only then did she go back for Luke. He collapsed onto the dirt floor as soon as she got him inside. The storm hit then, a solid wall of wind and snow that shrieked through the canyon, sealing them in. In the flickering light of the lantern she had salvaged from Caleb's saddlebag, she tended to Luke's wounds, just as she had in the lamplight of her own cabin. The scene was a haunting echo of their first meeting. She cleaned the gash on his side, her touch as gentle as she could make it. He winced, but his eyes never left her face, watching her with an expression of pained wonder. She worked in silence, her mind a numb buzz of activity. She found a small stack of firewood left by the cabin's last occupant and, using an ember from the dying fire outside, managed to start a small, smoky fire in the crude stone hearth. The warmth was a blessing, a small circle of life in the frozen dark. It was near dawn when Caleb woke. His eyes fluttered open, filled first with confusion, then with a dark, simmering rage as he found himself bound. He tested the ropes, his muscles straining against them. "Evelyn," he rasped, his voice raw. He tried to soften it, to coat it with the manipulative tone she knew so well. "Untie me, girl. This is foolishness. That drifter has filled your head with nonsense. You are my wife. We will go home, and we will forget this ever happened." She did not look at him. She continued to press a clean piece of her cloak against Luke's side. His voice hardened. "Do you hear me? I am your husband. I will forgive this. I will forgive you. Just untie me, and we will deal with him together." When she still did not respond, his voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "If you do not untie me, I swear to you, I will find you. There is no place on this earth you can hide from me. I will hunt you down, and I will drag you back, and you will spend the rest of your miserable life regretting this day." Evelyn slowly, deliberately, folded the blood-stained cloth. She turned to face him, her expression not one of anger or fear, but of a vast, weary calm. The woman he was threatening was already gone. There was nothing left to betray. "Caleb," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through his threats. "You broke me long before I ever betrayed you. You took everything from me, piece by piece. My laughter, my hope, my own name, until there was just a hollow thing in your house that answered to my name. That is the thing you own, not me." Caleb stared at her, his mouth agape, a string of curses dying on his lips. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, and he did not recognize what he saw. He gave a short, ugly laugh. "You think he wants you, a broken, used-up thing like you? He will leave you the first chance he gets. You have thrown your life away for nothing." From his spot by the fire, Luke stirred. "Go, Evelyn," he said, his voice weak, strained with pain. "He is right about one thing. I bring ruin. Go now. Save yourself. I am not worth saving." She looked from her husband's hateful face to Luke's pain-filled one. Two men, both offering her a different kind of prison. Caleb's of cruelty, Luke's of guilt. She would accept neither. She walked back to Luke's side and knelt, taking his hand in hers. It was cold, but he weakly curled his fingers around hers. She looked at him, her eyes fierce and unwavering. "Promise me tonight," she said, her voice a low, intense whisper, her words a direct challenge to the despair in his eyes. "Is not the end." Outside, the storm roared, throwing itself against the small cabin in a blind, white fury. Inside, in the small circle of firelight, surrounded by enemies and doubt, Evelyn's choice was finally, irrevocably made. The storm lasted for 2 days. 2 days sealed in a cold, dark tomb with a monster and a ghost. Evelyn moved with a methodical, dreamlike calm, her actions dictated by the simple, brutal necessities of survival. She kept the fire lit. She melted snow for water. She rationed the last of the bread and meat between herself and Luke, whose fever had returned with a vengeance. Caleb watched them from the corner, his eyes burning with a silent, impotent fury, his threats and promises eventually fading into a sullen, watchful silence. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind died, and a profound, echoing silence fell over the mountains. The world was reborn in a clean, blinding expanse of white. It was time. She left Caleb tied. She took his rifle, a heavy, cold weight of authority in her hands. She took his thick woolen coat, the one stained with a patch of Luke's blood from the fight. She did not say goodbye to Luke. Words were too fragile, too final. She simply met his fever-bright eyes for a long moment, a silent promise passing between them. And then she walked out into the cold, bright world. She rode Caleb's horse this time. It was a strong, steady animal, and it carried her out of the canyon and down the treacherous, snow-choked slopes with an unwavering gait. The ride to redemption was a journey through a world scrubbed clean of all color, a landscape of black rock and white snow under a sky of pale, indifferent blue. Evelyn did not feel the cold. She did not feel the exhaustion that pulled at her bones. She felt a strange and terrible clarity, a sense of purpose so absolute it left no room for fear. Her arrival in town was a disruption, a tear in the fabric of a normal day. Men stopped their conversations on the boardwalk, their mouths agape. Women peered from the windows of the general store, their faces masks of shock and curiosity. She was a wild sight, a lone woman on a man's horse, with a man's rifle held across her lap and a man's blood-stained coat on her back. She ignored their stares. She rode directly to the sheriff's office and dismounted, her movements stiff but deliberate. Sheriff Brody was a man whose face had been carved by years of hard sun and harder decisions. He was sitting at his desk, nursing a cup of coffee. When she walked in, he looked up, his expression of mild annoyance changing to one of wary attention as he took in her appearance. She laid the heavy rifle on his desk. The sound of the wood and steel against the worn oak was the only sound in the room. Then she shrugged off the coat and laid it beside the gun, the dark stain stark against the pale wood. "My name is Evelyn Wright," she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "My husband, Caleb, is in an old trapper's cabin, about a day's ride north of here, in a narrow canyon. He is tied up. There is another man with him, a drifter named Luke Mercer. He is wounded. My husband tried to kill him." Sheriff Brody leaned back in his chair. His eyes narrowed. Studying her face, he had seen a lot in his years. But this was new. He had heard Caleb's bragging in the saloon. He had seen this woman, a silent, frightened shadow. In the general store, the woman standing before him now was not that person. "And how did your husband come to be tied up, Mrs. Wright?" he asked, his voice a low, even rumble. "I tied him up," she said simply, "after he was knocked unconscious." The story came out then, not in a torrent of emotion, but in a calm, factual recitation of the events of the past weeks, the broken wagon, the fever, hiding Luke in her cellar, the fight in the cabin, the hunt, the brutal battle in the canyon. She left nothing out. She confessed to aiding a stranger, to lying to her husband, to tying him and leaving him. She told the truth, the whole, unvarnished, complicated truth. By the time she finished, a small crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office, drawn by the spectacle, their faces pressed against the glass. The story had already begun to ripple through the town, when Sheriff Brody led her from his office to the small, empty cell in the back. The whispers followed her. They were a mix of condemnation and grudging respect. Many of the women, like Mrs. Gable, shook their heads, their face tight with judgment. To stand against a husband, no matter how cruel, was to stand against the natural order of things. But a few, a very few, looked at her with something else in their eyes. Martha, a widow who had buried 2 husbands and knew the hardships of this life, gave a slow, deliberate nod of understanding. Evelyn was not in the cell for long. The sheriff and 2 deputies rode out, following the directions she had given them with precise, clear detail. They returned late the next day with both men. Caleb, sullen and bruised, was locked in the cell she had just vacated. Luke, pale and barely conscious, was taken not to the cell, but to the doctor's small surgery. Evelyn was released. Her crime of aiding Luke Mercer was a complicated matter, but Caleb's reputation had preceded him. Once the sheriff started asking questions, stories that had long been whispered in the shadows came out into the light. A story about a cattle deal that had gone sour, with the other man left beaten and broke. Suspicions about a farmhand who had disappeared after arguing with Caleb over wages. Caleb's cruelty, once a private matter for his wife to endure, was now a public concern. The town, in its rough and ready way, had made its judgment. Evelyn Wright might have broken the law, but Caleb Wright had broken the unspoken code of human decency one too many times. Luke's recovery was a slow and quiet affair. He was too weak to be moved far, but too conspicuous to remain at the doctor's office. It was the widow Martha who offered a solution. She lived in a small, neat house at the edge of town, a place of quiet gardens and sturdy fences. She took Luke in without a second thought, her reasons her own. A man who earns the loyalty of a woman like that, she told the doctor, deserves a safe place to heal. Evelyn visited him every day. She would walk the length of the town, her head held high, ignoring the gossip that buzzed in her wake. She was a changed woman, and the townsfolk saw it. The frightened, downcast wife was gone, replaced by a woman of quiet strength and unshakable purpose. She would sit by Luke's bedside in Martha's quiet, sunlit room, mending his clothes, reading to him from a book of poems Martha owned, or simply sitting in a comfortable silence as he slept. They did not speak of the future. They did not speak of promises. They spoke of the changing light, of the taste of Martha's chicken soup, of the small, simple things that made up a day. They were two survivors, quietly, carefully, learning to heal. Weeks passed. The deep snows of the high country melted, and the prairie began a slow, hesitant transformation. The stark white and gray gave way to the soft, hopeful green of new grass. Patches of wildflowers, blue and yellow and purple, appeared on the hillsides like scattered jewels. Spring had come to the land, and with it, a sense of new beginnings. Evelyn, with the help of Martha and two other old women who had seen too much of the world to be shocked by anything, did the unthinkable. She filed for a legal divorce from Caleb. It was an act of profound scandal, an unheard-of rebellion. But in the small, dusty courthouse, she stood before the circuit judge, a formidable man with a long white beard, and she told her story one last time. She was not defended by a lawyer, for she had no money for one. She was defended by the quiet, unwavering presence of the three women beside her, their faces a testament to a lifetime of endurance. Mrs. Albright, the preacher's widow, spoke for her. "There are laws of man, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong. "And there are laws of God, and I believe God does not require any woman to suffer the cruelty of a man like Caleb Wright." The divorce was granted. The homestead was to be sold, with the proceeds split. Caleb, facing other charges, was to be sent to the territorial prison. Evelyn was free. The day she won her freedom was the day Luke decided he had to leave. He was strong now, his wounds healed into scars, his face tanned by the long hours he spent helping Martha in her garden. He saw Evelyn's freedom not as an opportunity, but as a danger to her. He was still a man with a past, a deserter, a drifter. To stay would be to tarnish her new, hard-won reputation, to invite the very ruin he had always carried with him. She found him by the corral at the edge of town, saddling his horse, his bedroll tied neatly behind him. The sight of it was a cold fist in her stomach. "You are leaving," she said. It was not a question. He did not turn to face her. He kept his hands busy with a strap, his knuckles white. "It is for the best, Evelyn. You have a chance now, a clean start. You do not need a man like me bringing trouble to your door. Trouble found me long before you did." "Luke," she said softly, coming to stand beside him, "you found me in the middle of it." "It is not right," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he was trying to suppress. "I cannot give you a proper life. I have nothing to offer, no name, no land, no future." She reached out and laid her hand on his arm, forcing him to stop his work, to look at her. His gray eyes were filled with the old, familiar pain, the guilt he carried like a shroud. "I ain't asking for a future," she said, her voice low and fierce, her eyes locking with his. She was not the pleading girl by the fire. She was a woman stating her terms. "A future is just a big, empty space. I do not know what to do with it. I'm asking for tomorrow, just one, and maybe—" She took a breath, her gaze unwavering. "One more after that." Her words stripped away all his defenses. He saw the truth in them. She was not asking for a promise he could not keep. She was offering a reality they could build together, one day at a time. The weight he had carried for so long, the ghost of his brother, the shadow of Anna, the fear of his own destructive nature, seemed to lift, just for a moment. With a sound that was something between a sigh and a sob, he pulled her to him. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her so tightly she could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against her cheek. It was not a kiss of passion, but an embrace of profound, silent homecoming. He was not promising forever. He was not promising safety or an easy life. He was promising tomorrow. And for two people who had been to the edge of darkness and back, tomorrow was everything. They rode out at dawn. The town of redemption, with its gossip and its judgments and its unexpected kindness, lay sleeping behind them. They did not ride as fugitives, escaping a past that hunted them. They rode as partners, starting again. They had no destination, only a direction, west, toward the unwritten horizon. The prairie behind them was still a cruel and unforgiving place, a land of harsh winds and long shadows. But ahead of them, the sun was rising, and the horizon was burning with a brilliant, impossible gold. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. Tell us where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect. Subscribe to our Wild West Campfire channel, and feel free to share your thoughts in English.